Good afternoon. In 1989, I thought I'd become a real doctor when I finished my internal medicine residency. Little did I know at that time that it would take me 20 years until 2009 until I could really understand the definition of health and the real difference between health and healthcare. It was in 2009 that I went to Ikaria, Greece. Ikaria is a small island of Greece, about 25 miles off the coast of Turkey. And the reason that I went there is that I was on a research expedition with Dan Buettner. Dan is the explorer and author of the best-selling book Blue Zones. And blue zones are places in the world where people live the longest. In fact, people in blue zones live 12 higher quality years on average than we do here in the United States. Ikaria was the 5th blue zone to be discovered after Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, and even one in the United States, Loma Linda, California, because of the population of Seventh-day Adventists. And our trip to Ikaria was to validate some of the common themes that Dan and his team had seen in the other 4 blue zones, and to also find out the secrets of longevity in this small island. Well, it may not surprise you that one of the secrets, of course, was their diet. All over Greece, and certainly in Ikaria, they focus on eating the Mediterranean diet. Very heavy in plant-based foods. They use olive oil instead of butter. There's a healthy dose of red wine. But in Ikaria, it's somewhat of a supercharged Mediterranean diet, and that's because the island is so small and so remote with no natural harbors that over time it's been extremely difficult to import and export any foods at all, let alone processed foods. And so they've learned to be extremely self-sufficient, and essentially they only eat what they grow. Organic to them is a necessity, not something that you get in Whole Foods. In addition to diet, they also move a lot, but you'll never see them going to the gym. In fact, I spent 3 weeks there, and I'm not sure I ever saw a treadmill or a Lifetime Fitness or any gym like that. But they're always moving. And that's because the terrain is so rocky, it's so hilly and mountainous that just to get out in and out of their house, just to visit their relatives or friends, going in and out of that space is a mini workout in and of themselves. You can see the women on the screen. It's not unusual to see elderly women fishing for their own dinner that evening. And there was also a strong connection to the church. Speaking with many of them, I'm not sure that the connection to the church was necessarily religious, but it was more about the ritual. And we've seen this in so many of the other blue zones. And there's been good research to show that attending faith-based services 4 times a month can expand longevity by between 4 and 14 years. The other interesting thing about the history of Ikaria is that because it was so isolated and so remote, you'll hear that theme over and over again, the Greek government in the 1920s and 1930s thought that it was a great place to exile communists who they wanted to keep in an isolated location. So at one point, there were actually more communists exiled in Ikaria than there were native Icarians. And as a result, there's been a huge foundation of good socialist ideals on the island, and it permeates everything that they do with each other. There's a lot of partnership and sharing and making sure that everyone can participate in events, no matter who the haves or the have-nots really are. And yes, just like us, the Icarians have stress too. But what they do differently, as in the other blue zones, is that they have a way to de-stress daily. This is, we just broke out in dance. almost every evening while we were there, and that's not unusual. But they also just have coffee with their friends, and what they do regularly and on a daily basis is take a nap. In Okinawa, Japan, they take a moment to remember their ancestors on a daily basis. In Loma Linda, they pray, and in Sardinia, they just have happy hour. And one other very important element is that the elderly are honored, and everyone has purpose. So regardless of whether you're young or middle-aged or aging, everyone has purpose and a responsibility to the family. This is so important that we all have purpose. I'm not sure that I spoke to anyone there who ever referred to themselves as retired. Maybe rewired, but not retired, because they would always have responsibility to accomplish certain goals during the day. This 80-plus-year-old priest just had a blast every Sunday as he got on his ATV to go from village to village to conduct church services. Well, the demographers that went on our trip with us validated that Ikaria is in fact a blue zone. They have the smallest amount of middle-aged mortality in the world, as well as a very low rate of cancer and heart disease, as well as lung disease, actually, despite the incidence of smoking. But that excellent health, we found out, was not because they had excellent access to health care. And we found that out in a very difficult way. This is Emmanuel. I'll introduce you to him. His name is Emmanuel Tambakakis, and I have his permission to tell his story. Emmanuel was the videographer on our trip. He was freelancing on this gig, but his day job was with CNN International, which is frankly what saved his life. You'll hear about that in a moment. This trip, this expedition to Ikaria that we took, was widely covered by the media, and Dan was extremely excited to be doing a satellite segment with Anderson Cooper, and he had selected the most beautiful vista in Ikaria. So Dan was standing in the thermal radioactive waters at the base of a rocky cliff, and Emmanuel was on the road up above getting the satellite hookups connected so that it would be a successful segment. Before we knew it, Emmanuel fell over that cliff, 50 feet, like a rag doll. And I was the first responder. I got halfway up the hill and found my teammate unconscious and bloody, certainly unable to respond. And through all the blood, I was lucky that I noticed that he had clear fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, coming out of his left ear. And it made me realize that he probably had an epidural bleed. For those of you in the audience who don't know what that is, that means he had a bleed in his brain, and he probably had about an hour to live without emergent care. Here's the problem. There wasn't care on the island. This island had 2 doctors, 1 clinic, an almost broken x-ray machine, a very broken stretcher, no CAT scanner. We couldn't take the helicopter to the neighboring island because it was dusk and not safe. And there was no plane. The only commercial plane of the day had been earlier in the day at 10 in the morning. So thankfully for the fact that he worked for CNN, and thankfully for the fact that some other being intervened and our Blackberries worked, we got in touch with CNN, who worked with the Greek government, and they sent a military plane so that we could air evacuate Emmanuel from Ikaria. I accompanied him on that very long 1-hour flight. And when I could finally delegate my sense of responsibility to the flight surgeon, it was the first time in my career that the words health and health care were no longer synonymous. The newspaper that covered this story, called Tovima, had a quote in there that I will translate, but I'll say it in Greek first. It says, "Zoume poli ke malon katatihi," which means we live a long time, but it's probably just because of good luck. But I think that that newspaper actually underestimated the reason for the longevity in Ikaria. The poverty, the remoteness, and the need for self-reliance actually naturally created a place that gave them the gift of life. Well, it's highly doubtful that any of us, or the majority of us, would go to Okinawa or Sardinia or Loma Linda or Ikaria, even though it's quite beautiful. I'd recommend that you go there. And I also doubt that any of us would voluntarily put ourselves in a state of poverty in order to have this long life. So the real question is, how do we maintain our current wonderful, resource-rich lives, but yet give ourselves some of these 12 years back? And that's the question that Dan set out to answer in these city makeovers. Can we reverse engineer our own lives to match some of the environmental elements that bring life to these other places in the world? And the answer to that is yes. And where he started was in Albert Lea, Minnesota. Albert Lea is about 70 miles south of Minneapolis. It's a town of about 18,000 people. And he selected that town for a few reasons. One, it was small enough to make a difference, but large enough to get community support. But even more importantly, because he put out an RFP process to select this town, he saw from the application process that everyone from the public officials to the businesses to the people themselves were very motivated to create change. And so in late 2009, he set off to make over Albert Lea, Minnesota. So where do you start? Well, you start by looking at a life radius. Most of what